This section clearly lays out the core problem. We're working with scikit-learn's SplineTransformer, a tool used for preprocessing data, specifically a feature representing age in years. The age data ranges from 18 to 65 years. The goal is to create a basis of 3 cubic splines using the SplineTransformer and to figure out which parameter settings will achieve this. It's all about understanding how to configure the tool to get the desired result. This describes the specific tool we're using. Scikit-learn's SplineTransformer. Scikit-learn is a popular Python library for machine learning. The SplineTransformer is used for preprocessing numerical features by transforming them into a spline basis. Spline basis is a fancy way of saying we represent the original variable using several piecewise polynomial functions. This is useful for modeling nonlinear relationships. This is the quiz question itself. It presents 4 different ways to configure the SplineTransformer, each with different values for the n_knots and degree parameters. We need to determine which of these configurations will result in a basis of exactly 3 cubic splines. We need to analyze each option to find which one meets the requirements of creating 3 cubic splines. This is option A. The SplineTransformer is configured with n_knots equals 4 number of knots is 4, and degree equals 3 cubic spline. This option will not produce 3 cubic splines. This is option B, with n_knots equals 3 and degree equals 3 . Similar to option A, this configuration also doesn't produce 3 cubic splines. Here's option C, with n_knots equals 4 and degree equals 2 quadratic spline, not cubic. This won't work because it uses a quadratic spline instead of a cubic spline. Option D, n_knots equals 5 and degree equals 3 . Again, this option does not result in 3 cubic splines. Option C, SplineTransformer, n_knots equals 4, degree equals 2, knots equals, uniform, represents a quadratic spline, instead of a cubic spline. To create n cubic splines, we need n plus 3 knots. Since 4 knots are specified, it would imply only one spline, 4 minus 3 equals 1. Therefore, this option is incorrect. Option D, SplineTransformer, n_knots equals 5, degree equals 3, knots equals, quantile, uses 5 knots and a cubic spline. This would result in only 2 splines, 5 to 3 equals 2, making it also incorrect. The specification of knots equals, quantile, affects how the knots are placed, but not the fundamental relationship between the number of knots, the degree of the spline, and the resulting number of splines. This section simply introduces the core topic of the quiz, selecting the right parameters for scikit-learn's SplineTransformer . The core problem is laid out here. We're asked to find the correct parameter settings for creating a specific type of spline. The goal is to understand how to create 3 cubic splines using SplineTransformer and its parameters. This part presents the quiz question. It sets the context. We're dealing with ages between 18 and 65, and the goal is to generate 3 cubic splines using SplineTransformer in scikit-learn. The options will be evaluated based on the relationship between the number of knots, n_knots, the degree of the spline, which determines the type of spline, in this case cubic, meaning degree 3, and the number of splines we want to create, 3. It's important to remember that SplineTransformer in scikit-learn uses knots to define piecewise polynomials to create the spline basis. Let's analyze each option presented in the following lines. This is option A. It shows n_knots equals 6 and degree equals 3 . This option would create a basis of 3 cubic splines, as per the formula explained later in the passage. This option B, with n_knots equals 3 and degree equals 3 will not create 3 cubic splines. It is incorrect because the formula requires n plus d knots, where n is the number of splines, 3 in this case, and d is the degree, 3 for cubic splines. Option C uses a quadratic spline, degree 2, instead of a cubic spline, degree 3. It is incorrect because it does not meet the cubic spline requirement. Option D, with n_knots equals 5 and degree equals 3 will also not create 3 cubic splines. It is incorrect because, as discussed previously, it does not match the required number of knots for 3 cubic splines. This question tests understanding of the SplineTransformer spline_transformer specifically how parameters n_knots number of knots, and degree degree of the polynomial work together to define the spline basis. A cubic spline has a degree of 3. The number of knots determines the number of piecewise polynomial segments. We'll examine several SplineTransformer parameter settings to see which correctly create a basis of 3 cubic splines. Let's dive in. The goal is to find the correct parameter settings within the SplineTransformer function from the SplineTransformer library to generate a basis consisting of 3 cubic splines. Cubic splines are piecewise polynomial functions of degree 3. The provided multiple-choice options will be assessed to determine which combinations produce the desired outcome. Let's see what each option offers. This option specifies 6 knots and a degree of 3 cubic. The formula to find the number of splines, n, is n equals n_knots, degree . In this case, n equals 6 minus 3 equals 3 . This correctly generates 3 cubic splines. This one works. Here, n_knots is 3, and degree is 3. Using the formula n equals n_knots, degree we get n equals 3 minus 3 equals 0 . This results in 0 splines, not the required 3. This doesn't work. This option uses a degree of 2, indicating a quadratic spline, not a cubic spline. Even if we apply the formula n equals n_knots, degree it won't produce 3 cubic splines because the degree is incorrect. Nope, wrong degree. With 5 knots and a degree of 3, applying the formula yields n equals 5 minus 3 equals 2 . This produces 2 cubic splines, not 3. Close, but not quite right. Based on the analysis of each option, only option A correctly fulfills the requirement of producing 3 cubic splines. Option A is the clear winner. This question asks you to select the correct parameters for scikit-learn's SplineTransformer to create a basis of 3 cubic splines, given an age range of 18 to 65 years. It tests your understanding of how the number of knots and the degree of the spline are related. Here, the number of knots is 6 and the degree is 3 cubic. The formula, number of splines equals n_knots, degree, shows 6 minus 3 equals 3 splines. This option is correct. This option has 3 knots and a degree of 3. Using the formula, 3 minus 3 equals 0 splines. This is incorrect. Although the formula could be applied, the degree is 2, quadratic, not cubic, so this is incorrect. This has 5 knots and a degree of 3. The formula gives 5 minus 3 equals 2 splines. Also, note that quantile knot placement doesn't affect the core relationship between knots, degree, and the number of splines. Incorrect. This parameter in SplineTransformer determines the number of knots used to define the piecewise polynomial segments of the spline. More knots lead to a more flexible spline that can capture more complex curves. This parameter specifies the degree of the polynomials used in each segment of the spline. A cubic spline uses degree equals 3. A quadratic spline uses degree equals 2. Higher degrees lead to more complex curves. This parameter determines how the knots are placed along the range of the input data. Uniform places them evenly spaced. Quantile places them at quantiles of the data distribution. The placement of knots affects the shape of the resulting spline, but not the number of spline segments. This is the key formula. To obtain the number of cubic splines, you subtract the degree, 3 for cubic, from the number of knots, n underscore knots. This question is a multiple choice quiz problem about using scikit-learn's spline transformer to create a basis of 3 cubic splines for a feature representing age, in years, ranging from 18 to 65. The choices present different parameter settings for the spline transformer and you're asked to identify those which correctly produce the desired outcome. This tests your understanding of how the number of knots and the degree of the splines interact to determine the basis. It's a great way to assess your grasp of spline interpolation techniques within the scikit-learn framework. This question is a multiple choice quiz problem about using scikit-learn's spline transformer to create a basis of 3 cubic splines for a feature representing age, in years, ranging from 18 to 65. The choices present different parameter settings for the spline transformer and you're asked to identify those which correctly produce the desired outcome. This tests your understanding of how the number of knots and the degree of the splines interact to determine the basis. It's a great way to assess your grasp of spline interpolation techniques within the scikit-learn framework. This option uses 6 knots and sets the degree to 3 cubic spline. Recall that to create n cubic splines, n plus 3 knots are needed. Here, 6 knots means 6 minus 3 equals 3 cubic splines, fulfilling the requirements of the problem. The knots equals uniform. Argument means the knots are placed uniformly across the age range. This is a correct answer. This option uses 6 knots and sets the degree to 3 cubic spline. Recall that to create n cubic splines, n plus 3 knots are needed. Here, 6 knots means 6 minus 3 equals 3 cubic splines, fulfilling the requirements of the problem. The knots equals uniform. Argument means the knots are placed uniformly across the age range. This is a correct answer. This option uses only 3 knots for a cubic spline. Using the formula, we find that 3 minus 3 equals 0 splines. This is an incorrect answer, as it does not create 3 cubic splines. It results in no splines at all. This option uses only 3 knots for a cubic spline. Using the formula, we find that 3 minus 3 equals 0 splines. This is an incorrect answer, as it does not create 3 cubic splines. It results in no splines at all. This option uses 4 knots but specifies a degree of 2, indicating a quadratic spline, not a cubic spline is required. This is an incorrect choice as it fails to meet the problem specification for cubic splines. This option uses 4 knots but specifies a degree of 2, indicating a quadratic spline, not a cubic spline is required. This is an incorrect choice as it fails to meet the problem specification for cubic splines. This option uses 5 knots for a cubic spline, degree equals 3, meaning there would be 5 minus 3 equals 2 splines. The knots equals quantile. Parameter indicates knots will be positioned at quantiles of the data. However, the number of splines generated is not correct. Hence this option is incorrect. This option uses 5 knots for a cubic spline, degree equals 3, meaning there would be 5 minus 3 equals 2 splines. The knots equals quantile. Parameter indicates knots will be positioned at quantiles of the data. However, the number of splines generated is not correct. Hence this option is incorrect.